Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. We're going to be talking about love here again in minutes and contrasting that to the Elohim of the Old Testament and talking a little bit about cargo cults and the might of thoughts. A lot in diverse areas. First of all, who is Edward Albert Meier? It's always a good question to ask. He is a man who is 80 years old. He's a very prolific author. I heard in a recent interview he said that he has written over 50 books now. He lives in northern Switzerland, about 45 minutes to an hour east of Zurich, in a little tiny mountain village called Hinterschmidruti, which is nestled among the mountains and pine forests in northern Switzerland. His writings are without compare. It's really hard to put into words the depth of the knowledge of his writings. The book called The Might of Thoughts, Macht der Gedanken, I think I'm going through, it's the fourth time now that I'm going through this book. And I never intended to read this book this many times, but I've developed a habit where I read a certain amount of it every morning and try to understand and process what it's saying. Billy's writings are a little difficult to describe. When he was a very young boy, about, 8 years old, I guess he had his first contact with an extraterrestrial man named Swath. And this occurred in Bulak, Switzerland, which is a little farther north. But before he had any contacts with Swath, he was already in the process of learning very, very many profound things. And there's a writing, it's only 4 pages long. It's called How It All Began. It's really had a tremendous impact on me. And this is something that occurred on a mild night in May in 1941. And Billy crawled out a lower window in his bedroom and sat down on a simple bench that his father had made, and he looked up at a beautiful starry sky. So let me pick up here and just read this to you, and then we'll discuss it a little bit. It says, a little drowsy, I looked out the window, and through which I saw the clear starry sky. So I rose from my bed and went to the window and climbed out. As it was almost at ground level. Outside, I sat down on the simple bench which stood against the wall of the house, which my father had built. And I could not see the moon. However, the sky was clear and wrapped in a velvety black, and millions of stars shone down from the firmament. For a few minutes, I sat there like that and looked up to the stars while pondering and in my thoughts flying far into the universe. However, suddenly something peculiar happened inside of me, which for the next moment irrevocably changed my life. Strangely touched, I looked at my hands and my body and could only vaguely recognize them. So I touched my body and felt it. And then I heard my own voice say, my life is made out of the love of creation. And I could not explain why I said that, and which power led me to speak these words. A slight shiver came over me through the night, although the night was quite warm. And then I noticed that I also felt peculiar. Nonetheless, I was not frightened. Again, I looked up to the stars and recognized that the stars were distant suns in the vast outer space, and that these shone by the means of their own power, by themselves, even though they were created in the light of the love of creation. as is everything in the whole universe. And again, words, the origins of which I could not decipher. Very interesting. The sense of which I was, however, able to grasp. As with the first words, escaped from my lips. Everything is created out of the light of love. And then further words followed. The space between the stars is empty, and yet not empty. And everything that exists in the whole universe is a living vision. Everything is creation, and creation itself. The words which came from my mouth penetrated deeply into me, and in them I recognized that the true source of life is the light of the true creational love, which in its vitality creates all life and contains within itself all laws and recommendations of creational order and all information about life and death. And I'm going to try to decode a little bit of this so we can, at least in our material consciousness, get a better understanding of what this is saying. Notice it says that everything is created out of the light of love. So does it mean that light is an aspect of love literally? Or is light being used as a metaphor? Or could it be that, to an extent, light is an aspect of the love of creation? And again, perhaps there's both a visible and an invisible aspect to light. It seems that light plays a role in the creation aspect of things. Again, it's said there in that little passage that we read, everything is created out of the light of love. Now, one of the things that came to me, besides the light aspect of this, is that I contrasted this to what the Might of Thoughts says about our thinking. It's exactly the opposite of the negative thoughts which grow wildly out of... When we have negative thoughts, these thoughts grow wildly, and they create suffering and confusion in our minds, in our mind's eye. By contrast, when we're contemplating the love of creation, it seems like it has a way of ordering our mind and our psychology and our thinking and freeing us. Remember, negative thoughts lead to an imprisonment. It leads to repeating thoughts which run out of control. You make yourself miserable, and you probably end up making other people miserable as well. Now, if you remember, one of the creational natural laws is love. And love is the highest principle in all creation. And through it, everything exists in absolute logic. So there is a logic to creation's love. Even though creation is not a person, it's not a heavenly father, and it really doesn't have a personality the way we think of a personality. Let's think about that again. Love is the highest principle in creation, and through it, everything exists in absolute logic. So the word absolute implies an unquestionable finality. And logic means a proper, reasonable way of thinking about something. It also means the science of reasoning. So without the love of creation, nothing would be able to exist. And in Contact Report 10, it says a little bit about this logic of creation. And within each human, the infinite has its seat. However, very few are able to recognize this. To wake up the infinite requires reasonable logic and being free from unreal teachings. So when we start to have logic and our thinking, I think it makes it easier for us to understand this love of creation. And I often quote these passages about love. I've been very inspired to do that. That's the only way that I can explain it. Because every tiny plant and every tiny animal fulfills its purpose in love. And everything that has been created is because of the love of creation. Let me continue here. I recognize that the light which the stars emitted was a light in the visible spectrum. However, the light of true love remains invisible, creational, and for all great time. So there's an invisible aspect of the light of love. And indeed, the beaming stars were there, which stirred in me an unfamiliar longing for the vast distances and faraway worlds. And I wonder how many of us have looked up at a beautiful starry sky and felt this longing for the vast distances. Then words suddenly formed on my lips again, which said, since ancient times you have lived among the stars. And this is young Billy at about 4 years old in 1941, having these remembrances, what will we call them? Since ancient times you have lived among the stars. And suddenly I knew who I was, how I am, and what my mission is on this earth. And suddenly impulses came from somewhere, which I later recognized as impulses from the storage banks. And many good memories penetrated me and showed me the way to go in life. So there are storage banks in the universe, and Billy's getting signals from these storage banks. And he's just responding to these. He's saying things. And maybe it's the evolution, the highest essences of evolution that are programmed into his subconscious now, which are causing him to speak. It's a good question. This is very, very profound. This is only 4 pages. I suggest that you spend a little time, as I have many, many times, looking at this and trying to wrap your mind around it. So here's Billy. He's 4 years old. He's contemplating the love of creation. He understands that everything exists because of the love of creation. And he's having kind of these epiphanies of feelings and concepts that relate maybe to his previous lives. And he understands the basic and profound meaning of what creation is. Probably at 4 years old, he understood more about creation than you and I do. So let me read this paragraph. It says, already at the age of 4, this great recognition instantly changed my life. Because after I was familiarized with this insight and understanding by means of the impulses from the storage banks, and I also learned who I really was, what I had to learn and do in my life, and what my life task was, I looked at human beings, animals, and nature, as well as all existing things, in a completely new way, and I suddenly felt a great astonishment within myself about that, which I now discovered. Suddenly I saw myself in everything, in every fellow human being, in every flower or other plant, in every tree, in every shrub, in every animal, in snow and water, in the earth, in the lightning and the thunder, in clouds and wind and in sunshine, because everything was and is connected in true creational love and forms a unity which can never be separated. Even life and death are woven into it and are inseparably intertwined with each other. And exactly as a result of this connection, which was instantly clear to me, everything is mixed and connected in infinitely various ways through which innumerable manifestations of life and existences were created, exist, and continue to be created. Well, this is very, very profound and deep information about the love of creation. Now, let me contrast that, if I can, for a second. One of the things that Billy was taught by his extraterrestrial mentors, he had two. One was a man named Svath, who Billy met with for 11 years. Svath was from a race of human beings that live some 80 light years beyond our Pleiades in a different space-time configuration. They were called the Pleiadians for years, even though they never existed in the Pleiades, and I don't think any life exists in the Pleiades to speak of. However, the Plejaren wish to remain kind of anonymous. They're at such a high level of evolvement now. They're at the final stage of physical life. Their next evolution stage will be to the sixth stage of human evolution, which is kind of a half physical, half spiritual stage. So they kind of want to remain anonymous. They really don't. They have, I guess, what you'd call a federation of other peoples that they do have contact with. They really don't wish to have open contact with the people of Earth. Now, why would that be? Well, part of it is that their level of evolution makes it very difficult and uncomfortable for them to be around Earth people. In fact, very unhealthy. They actually lose control of the physical bodies because of the vibration of our thinking. But also, I think there are many groups on the Earth which are not ready for this kind of information. Let me talk to you a little bit about what's called the John Frum Cargo Cult. And there are a series of islands that are, I guess, referred to as Vanuatu. And one of these islands is called Tana. And John Frum is the name assigned to this individual. I think it was probably a series of individuals who contacted the natives on this island of Tana in Vanuatu between 1933 and about 1945, near the end of World War II. Very primitive culture living on a Pacific island northeast of Australia. And they had never seen technology before. They'd never seen airplanes and ships, and they probably brought bulldozers in, and they created an airstrip, and they saw all this cargo, and these people were just overwhelmed. They saw, towers created, which someone would sit in the tower and talk to the planes and bring the planes in, etc. Anyway, this whole thing left a tremendous, I would call it a scar on these simple people's psyche. So they still relive this moment, this time period in their life when these very advanced people from the United States came, and I believe the Japanese were there for a little while. I don't know all the details of that. But right around the 1940s, some 300,000 troops were stationed in this area. So what these people have done over many years is they build models of the planes. They've built like a little tower, and they sit in the tower, and they made for themselves wooden headsets, and they kind of worship John Frum. When another person they worship is someone they call Tom Navy. Anyway, it's a sad state of affairs. These people are literally waiting for John Frum to come back. Listen to what Chief Isaac Wan Nikaru says, the leader of this cargo cult. He says, talking to the BBC, was quoted as saying, John Frum was our God, our Jesus, and would eventually return. So they're waiting for the return of John Frum. Who knows if that was actually his name? I think it's more of a symbol of multiple military men that may have had interaction with these people. And let me read one section here. It says, and this is in Wikipedia, you can look at it for yourself. In 1941, followers of John Frum rid themselves of their money in a frenzy of spending, left the missionary churches, schools, villages, and plantations, moved inland to participate in traditional feast dances and rituals. European colonial authorities sought to suppress the movement, at one point arresting a teenage man who was calling himself John Frum, humiliating him publicly, imprisoning him, and ultimately exiling him along with other leaders of the cult to another island in the archipelago. So it's a very sad situation, and I wonder if our religions aren't a form of cargo cult. I also wonder if we're really, all of us, ready for some kind of public declaration by the leaders of a disclosure. Anyway, these people got their disclosure. The people on the island of Tana in Vanuatu got their disclosure, and it really caused big problems for them, which they still haven't shaken. They march around in parades carrying like these stick things. They paint on their chest USA. And they sing like God Bless America. It's just bizarre. It's a really strange thing. So I just thought it would be interesting to compare and contrast that for a minute with the love of creation. And something I will also contrast with the love of creation is this individual, Jehovah, by some. If you remember the Giza intelligences, around 3000 BC, went far below the Giza Plateau, under the leadership of a man named Erising. And he took his army into the land of Egypt and into these old cubicle constructions that were some 70,000 years old. So deep in the interior of the earth, below the pyramids, they converted these rooms and constructions for their purposes, which was a way of obtaining the goal of deceit, lying, and intrigues, spreading wrong teachings, and leading earth humans astray through religious teachings. So this is what happened. Now, the Meier information says Jehovah took leadership of the Giza intelligences about 310 BC. Now, if you look up the word Jehovah in the Bible Gateway software, you'll get no hits. www.biblegateway.com is a search engine. If you set it on NIV, you can search the NIV for things. Well, if you set it on King James, you'll get hits for Jehovah. Now, remember, the King James Version is an English translation of the Christian Bible, finished around 1611. It was written for the Church of England. And I thought it was very significant that there's this split between modern scholarship, which doesn't even recognize the name Jehovah, doesn't appear anywhere in the New International Version of the Bible. But in the King James, the first time it appears is Genesis 22, where Abraham is about to sacrifice his son. He's built this big altar with all these sticks. He's tied his son up. He's going to kill his son with a knife because he's been commanded by Jehovah to do this. And then he's going to burn all these sticks and burn the flesh of his son. Now, these Elohim really liked burnt offerings, whoever these Elohim were. I say they were the John Frums of 3000 BCE. They were renegades of the Pleiar, and they were part of these Giza intelligences, and they contacted Earth peoples with bad intentions. I don't think the John Frums from World War II that contacted the people in the island of Tanna in Vanuatu, northeast of Australia, Pacific Islands. I don't think our servicemen had bad intentions when they contacted these people of Vanuatu. However, the Giza intelligence, I believe, had bad intentions. They were manipulating people. They were using the Jews to wipe out a whole section of peoples that were following other quote-unquote gods, as I guess is my take on it. Let's say this. Anyway, Genesis 22:14. The story here is about the time when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, and the place is called Jehovah Jireh in the land of Morah. And it was the location where God told Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering. Again, these Elohim really liked the smell of burning flesh. Odd. It was very soothing to them. Now, there's a researcher, Mauro Biglino, who contacted someone at NASA in relation to this. And evidently, if you've been in space for a long time, when your cells oxidize, your skin gets old and oxidizes, your skin cells are still floating around inside the ship in this closed encased area because you're recycling the same air all the time. So, and they say it smells a lot like grilled meat. Odd, isn't it? Bizarre. So maybe these extraterrestrials, maybe Jehovah/Hen, as he's called, was one of these negative extraterrestrials that were using religion to control the people of the earth. Now, let's step forward a little bit. Deuteronomy 20:16. It says, "However, in the cities of the nations, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Do not leave alive anything that breathes." Okay, Jehovah, one of these Elohims, he's commanding the army of Israel to wipe out these other people which are following other gods, other Elohim that are on the earth. He says, completely destroy them all. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods. So, Jehovah didn't want them to worship these other gods. You only worship me. Or the other Giza intelligences later. Now, there's a translator named Mario Biglino from Italy who translated some 23 books for the Vatican. He had a contract with the Vatican's publisher, San Paolo, until he published a recent translation of the Masoretic texts. And he approached the Masoretic texts from a completely neutral point of view, a non-religious interpretation. Well, the Vatican didn't like that at all. Anyway, he translated 17 volumes of literal translations from the Old Testament. And what's recorded in the Old Testament is consonants, strings of consonants, no vowels. So what a translator does is he has to insert the correct vowel points and then translate the Hebrew. because the first Bibles were written, the Old Testament, in a sequence of consonants. So the work was done initially by these people called the Masoretes. So these are called Masoretic texts. So I'll give you an example of how the Masoretes, or how the religious interpretation of the Bible came about. One of the words in the original creation that appears is translated as the Spirit of God, which is called the Ruach. And I had a pastor who would translate this as the Spirit of God. I studied under a pastor named Colonel R.B. Thiem, who would translate the Hebrew, but he did it in a traditional way. If you look at the term Ruach, according to Mara Biglino, that the Ruach does not mean spirit. It means wind or anything flying in the air quickly causing wind. So in later theological elaborations, when a quote-unquote God figure was created, they attached the meaning of spirit to the word Ruach. But if you look at the Sub-Phoenician pictograms of Ruach, and that's where the Hebrew language came from, you will see that a Ruach looks very much like a disc. And the Ruach was said to be hovering over the waters of the earth, and without moving its quote-unquote wings, just hovering. And that's the same way. There are rapacious kinds of birds which do the same thing, like buzzards and hawks and eagles, which do the same kind of thing. They fly without flapping their wings, and they glide. So the Ruach, Elohim's Ruach, was hovering over the water, and it's the typical way, again, of flying for the rapacious birds. The Sumerians depicted the Elohim's Ruach in a little pictogram, a picture that looks like a flying craft, some form of disc, which goes very much along the way that the Meier material interprets this information. So if you remember again, Edward Albert Meier, he's 80 years old. He lives in Switzerland, in a tiny mountain village in, I guess you call it northern Switzerland, near Zurich. He grew up in Block, and he started having his first extraterrestrial contacts with a man named Svath. Svath would take him up into a ship and tell him about his previous lives, that he had been the people that we call today Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, and Muhammad. And in each one of these previous lives, he had taught an ancient universal teaching, which today is called the teaching of the Spirit. And so he was kind of a prophet in ancient times, and he taught the people of the earth about the creational natural laws. And there are basically three creational natural laws that exist. The law of love, which we've talked about earlier. This is the highest form of love. It's an effective love, as opposed to an affective love, which is romantic. The law of striving, which is the fundamental law of all evolution. Without striving, there is no life. Without striving, there is no happiness. Striving will be the source of your happiness in life. And the more you strive, the more and easier it is for you to remain in a neutral positive mindset. Now, you can get yourself out of a neutral positive mindset. A neutral positive mindset is the bipolar structure of everything that exists. It exists also within this law of harmony. So when you think in a neutral positive way, You're working and you're in a harmonious state in your mind. And how do you, one of the ways to tell or help keep you in this harmonious state of thinking is to tell yourself, I'm confident. Tell yourself, I'm optimistic. I'm relaxed. I'm enthusiastic. I'm cheerful. And I'm thankful. So repeat those ideas to yourself. I'm optimistic. I'm confident. I'm relaxed. I'm cheerful. I'm enthusiastic. And so it's all these ideas that you need to reinforce to yourself, because your thinking determines your circumstances in your life. So good thinking leads to good feelings. Good feelings lead to good habits. Because when you start to develop good habits, you recognize the feeling that you get when you're involved in these good habits. And I'll give you an example of a good habit that I've developed. Every morning, reading this book called The Might of Thoughts, Mach der Gedanken. So, and I often wake up in a completely dazed state of mind for whatever reason. And I can barely do anything but sit down and read. And what it helps to do is I start, okay, I'm thinking. Then when I get to thinking and a good harmonious mindset, I slowly start to wake up and I kind of go into a concentration where I'm able to pull out information from this book. One of the things that you will learn from the Might of Thoughts book, as well as the Way to Live book, is that you have a true nature. You have a true self, which comes kind of from your spirit, your spiritual consciousness. So remember, the spirit form is a fragment of the universal consciousness. It exists in an area called the superior colliculus, the area associated to sight. And when the spirit form leaves the body, you'll notice the light leaves the eyes of the human being or the person, the animal that has died. That's because the spirit form has the spirit energy, which enlivens the whole body. The spirit energy causes the heart to beat. And this little fragment of the universal consciousness, it's an operational universal fragment of the universal consciousness. It contains all the information of your previous lives. It sends impulses to your material consciousness that gives you guidance. Now you have a true I and a false I. The false I is kind of your personality in this life. It's what trips you up all the time. It's what goes into negative thinking. By the way, negative thinking grows wildly in your consciousness, and it produces confusion, and it produces a kind of an unsettled feeling. So the I, the false I, attempts to complicate and deny everything because it is endangered by knowledge, truth, and evolution. So what that false I is trying to do is to sabotage your evolution. Very strange. And this false I is characterized by something in the German which is called Gewaltsamkeit, which causes, just the bad feeling, the confusion. And one way to get out of the negative rotating thoughts is to simply contemplate a moment of gladness. I was talking earlier about the love of creation. And this, to me, when I read the stuff from how it all began, it does create a kind of gladness in the spirit, in the consciousness. Well, again, let me read again a paragraph from how it all began. It says, "This is everything of which I became aware during this night. As a little boy who was just 4 years old, everything which exists in the whole universe is a manifestation of the might and the infinite and true love of the mighty universal consciousness, which is simply called creation." So again, love is the highest principle in creation. And through it, everything exists in absolute logic. So every tiny plant and every tiny animal fulfills its purpose in love. The incredible splendor of nature is the visible expression of the love of creation. So let's talk about a moment of gladness now. A moment of gladness simply arises because one sees the snowflakes floating on a sunbeam, or a sunbeam which is mysteriously fingering through the forest. A moment of gladness can be a flower on the edge of a path, or a bird and its twittering, which please the consciousness. These are the moments of peace, of love, of happiness, of equalizedness, of harmony, as well as reflection and light. These are the moments which work deep into the inner part of the consciousness and make one's feelings tingle and please the psyche. And these moments and their distinguishing characteristics must be retained so that they constantly remain in your memory. So you can try to focus on these moments. And sometimes you can bring these moments back just by memorizing a few of these very profound statements in the Meier material. For example, there's a beautiful passage in the Goblet of Truth which is entitled, "What the Truth Knows to Say." And it continues and says, "Rivers, stones, plants, animals, bushes, trees, everything that crawls and flies on the earth is a life form with a spirit form. And these spirit forms are on a journey through time which involve many, many lifetimes. And death is just the passage to rebirth into the world of pure spirit. And many of these creatures are connected by psychic vibrations, and they're aware of each other. And if you see the flock of birds move on a dime, you're seeing this connectedness of all things in the creation. Everything is interwoven in creation. Now, unfortunately, the mass of modern human beings have no context for understanding what I'm saying, or no context for experiencing the true nature of the consciousness. Everything in our society suppresses this state of equalizedness. Everything in our society blocks these impulses in the feelings and the emotions. Everything in our society blocks the impulses of joys and feelings of happiness. So we are essentially blocking our own happiness. We are suppressing our own happiness. The impulses of the creation are there if we allow them to affect us. So again, this is from page 328 in the Way to Live book. It says, "Also from the outside, out of one's environment, and by the fellow human beings, all sorts of things are done whereby the true nature of the consciousness is suppressed. Attacks occur subliminally or quite openly, which have the zeal of one quickly forgetting everything which could raise the joy and the feeling of happiness, or which could bring the consciousness into a state of harmonious equalizeness. So, this is the challenge that we have here on the earth. Starting to understand the nature of creation, starting to understand what Billy was talking about and how it all began, trying to understand what life is, what the true nature of the superintelligence behind all things. One of the helpful ways, or one of the helpful things to look at, I think, is what the Way to Live book says on page 260, where it talks about the waves of the ocean. And just as the part piece of the creational spirit is in the human being, it's in a unity with all other creational spirit part pieces and the creation itself. So we're kind of like waves in the ocean. Every human being is like a wave in the ocean. We're really just part of the water, but we have a beginning and an ending. And we'll come back up as another wave in some future time. So this is the way of life. We're like waves in the ocean. We come up as a wave, we exist for a while, and then we go back into the ocean, which in this symbology is creation. Now, there is also something called learning and striving and anxiety associated with that. Let me read what it says here in the Way to Live book. And remember, whenever you're striving, whenever you're making progress, there's always something that's going to impede it. So don't let that something that's impeding your progress move you into a ausgartet state where you're out of the neutral positive. Anyway, he/she has anxiety about fulfilling his or her striving for the evolution. And she has anxiety about truthfully learning and practically experiencing the effect of truth. Now listen to what it says here. To really live means learning. But learning means to search for the truth, to find it, and to recognize and follow it. But living according to the truth means letting go of all anxiety. And it means to learn so that the understanding of the becoming and the passing arises. And the truth of the death is recognized as the passing of one level of existence for the becoming in another one. So we can live without really living. If we're learning, we're really living. And to really live means letting go of anxiety. And if we let a little bit of anxiety in, we're not living according to the truth. So try to take the time to recall your moments of gladness. Try to memorize a few phrases. Try to clarify your good thoughts, because there is a relationship between your synapses and learning. It is a human's nature, as with everything, to strive for that which is higher, for that which is fully developed. You won't be happy pursuing just fun. You won't be happy just pursuing entertainment. The only real true satisfaction comes from your striving. Okay, there's an important thing to understand here. Striving creates life. Striving means happiness. Striving is always fulfilling. If you don't strive, you'll fall into unwillingness and affliction. But inhibited striving and inhibited life bring inhibited evolution and stagnation, hopelessness and grief, confusion, irrationality, joylessness, cognitionless, unpeace, harmony. All of these are associated with a lack of striving. Striving requires the expenditure of effort, and it must be achieved through hard work. There will be multifarious powers that work against your striving. Believe me. Striving is something that is not just dropped into your lap. There are circumstances which work against the striving. They become obvious in your life when something is working against your striving. So the challenge is to remain neutral. Remember, there's always two poles. There's a plus and a minus, a pro and a con, a negative and a positive. There's always the two poles. Don't try to separate. Don't try to push the negative out of your life, because that's what your false eye wants you to do, right? Just push the negative out of your life. Get angry and push it out. No, you don't. It doesn't work quite that way. The striving is a diligent impulse of the evolution creation's drive. Is this striving? So there's the silent devotion related to striving. Billy has a very interesting article that's called Thoughts, Neutral Thoughts in Everyday Life. Thoughts about neutrality. Probably no other concept reveals the difference between theory and practice as seriously. This only becomes really apparent when one grapples with the topic seriously and deeply, from which then awareness also rises that applied neutrality quite conclusively makes everyday life easier. No one can assume that practicing neutral positive thinking and behavior. One can assume that practicing neutral positive thinking and behavior is the basis of life. And this causes happiness and peace and harmony. So many people feel unhappy. They're weighed down. They're subject to their fears and aggressions. This is that thing that opposes your striving. And people often face unknown or foreign things full of distrust. We have to kind of let that go. We have to learn, in order to be able to fathom new, unknown, and foreign things, however, there is needed an impartial, observant, objective, and a reasonable way of thinking. Only this action guarantees a result according to the facts. Well-intentioned, welfare, misunderstood sense of duty reasons which encourage interference in the lives of fellow human beings. We shouldn't interfere in the lives of fellow human beings. That was one thing I was trying to say about this whole disclosure thing. We shouldn't force the Meier information on people. We shouldn't force the existence of extraterrestrial life on people. Many people are not ready for this. Now, we have a very difficult challenge facing us here on the earth. And 2020 could be the year of the beginning of the end for the United States. I'm hoping that Billy's wrong. But he's saying that by the year 2020, which is only 3 years away, we could see the beginning of the end of the United States. We have a gigantic mountain of national debt, $16 trillion of national debt. So this is a very challenging time facing all of us. And I hope that putting this information out there helps people in dealing with what could be some very, very difficult times facing us here shortly. Anyway, You've been listening to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. Have a great day. Goodbye.